At 19, with the only man who ever wanted her 3 weeks in the ground, Tessa Brandt was handed a cardboard box and a one-way bus ticket, and told never to come back. She had $41 and a cold brass key her grandfather had pressed into her hand the night he died, a key she had never found a lock for. With nowhere left to go, she walked out to the rail yard where the old man had worked his whole life, shut down now, fenced off, forgotten by everyone but her, and there, sunk into the floor of the ruined engine house under years of grime, she found it. A steel hatch, padlocked, that no map said should exist. The brass key slid in and turned, and just as the door groaned open, somewhere down the dead tracks where no train had run in decades, she heard an engine coming. But that was the end of a long day, and the day had started on a porch. The box was already packed when Tessa came down the stairs that morning. It sat on the welcome mat with the flaps folded over each other, the way you close a box you do not intend to open again. Her name was written on the side in her aunt's blocky marker. Sandra stood in the doorway in her good coat, the one she wore to church and to anything she had decided in advance would be unpleasant. "Your uncle and I talked it over," Sandra said. "You're 19 now. That's an adult. The state stopped sending anything for you in February." Tessa looked at the box. She could see the corner of Pop's old denim coat sticking out of the top, and her 2 pairs of jeans and the paperback she had been halfway through. "You went through my room," Tessa said. "I packed your things. There's a difference." Sandra held out an envelope. Inside was a bus ticket and 2 20s and a 1. "There's a Greyhound at 11:40. It goes to the city. People find work in the city." From inside the house, Tessa heard the television. Her uncle was in there with it. Bowen Brandt had not come to the door, and that told her more than the box did. He was a big man who filled a room, and he had made himself small somewhere behind the wall so he would not have to watch. "Can I say goodbye to him?" Tessa said. It was not really a question. "He's not feeling well." Sandra glanced back into the dim hallway, then stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door most of the way shut behind her. "Tessa, we took you in. Nobody made us. You were 16 and your grandfather was sick, and somebody had to. That was 3 years of our lives." "He raised me," Tessa said. "Pop did. You took the house." Something flickered across her aunt's face and was gone. "The house was the estate. The estate had debts. You don't know the half of what that old man left us holding." She set the envelope on top of the box. 11:40. Don't miss it." The door closed. Tessa heard the deadbolt turn, which was a thing it had never done while she lived there. She stood on the porch for a while. A school bus went by at the end of the street with its lights flashing, and a man 2 houses down ran a leaf blower across a lawn that did not have many leaves on it. The ordinary noise of an ordinary Tuesday went on all around her, as if the bottom had not just dropped out of the world. She picked up the box. It was not heavy. 3 years of a life, and it was not heavy at all. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of a closed door only wore you out. What she felt instead was her grandfather's coat against her arm, and the small hard shape in the front pocket of her own jacket where she always kept it. The key. Pop had given it to her in the hospital, near the end, when the room smelled of disinfectant, and the machine beside the bed counted out his heartbeats in green numbers. His hands had been a mechanic's hands his whole life, broad and scarred and sure, and by then they shook so badly he could barely hold a cup. But he had closed her fingers around that key with all the strength he had left, and his grip had been the strongest thing in the room. "When you've got nowhere left, go to the yard," he had said. His voice was a rasp by then. "The key's for the floor. The rest you'll figure out. You always do." She had thought it was the morphine talking. The key's for the floor. She had turned it over in her hand 100 times since. An old brass thing with a square shank and a number stamped into the bow, worn smooth at the edges where a thumb had rubbed it across 4 decades. It did not fit the house. It did not fit the shed or the truck or the lockbox at the bank that turned out to be empty anyway. She had given up on it being for anything. But Pop did not waste words, not even dying ones. He had been the most deliberate man she ever knew. If he said the key was for the floor, then somewhere there was a floor, and he had told her where to go. Tessa walked to the bus station because she did not know what else to do with her feet. She sat on the bench under the schedule board with the box on her knees and watched the minute hand on the wall clock climb toward 11:40. The man behind the ticket window did a crossword. A woman with a toddler shared a bag of pretzels with him on the next bench over and asked Tessa if she wanted any. And Tessa said no thank you, and the woman left her alone after that. At 11:30, the bus pulled in, hissing, and the driver got out to stretch and smoke half a cigarette. People lined up with their bags. The woman with the toddler folded the stroller one-handed like she had done it 1,000 times. Tessa did not get up. She thought about the city, where she did not know a single person, where $41 would last about a day and a half. Then she pictured the yard 4 miles out on the county road, where she knew every rusted rail and every broken window, because Pop had taken her there since before she could remember. The bus doors folded shut. The driver swung the big machine around and pulled out onto the road, and the red taillights got smaller and smaller and then turned the corner and were gone. Tessa let out a breath she had been holding since the porch. "Wrong way anyhow," she said to no one. She walked back through town with the box under her arm. Calder was not much, and it was less every year. Half the storefronts on the main street wore brown paper in their windows. The grain elevator by the tracks had not taken a delivery in her lifetime. But the diner was open, the way it was always open. And as she passed it, the door swung and a voice called out, "Tessa Brandt." It was Della, who had run the diner for as long as there had been a diner. She came out onto the sidewalk wiping her hands on her apron, a broad woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. "I heard," Della said. She did not say what she had heard. "In a town that size, you did not have to. Where are you headed with that box?" "Out to the yard." Della looked at her for a moment over the top of the reading glasses. Whatever she saw, she decided not to argue with it. She went back inside without another word and came out half a minute later with a paper sack, warm and grease-spotted, and pushed it into Tessa's free hand. "2 egg sandwiches and a coffee," Della said. "Your grandfather ate breakfast at my counter every working day of his life. He never once let me give him anything for free, the stubborn old goat, so I'm giving it to you instead. You can fight me on it when you're 60. "I can't pay you," Tessa said. "I know you can't. That's what makes it a gift." Della folded her arms. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight, honey. I'll be all right." "That's not what I asked." "I'll be all right," Tessa said again, and she meant it the way you mean a thing you have decided to make true by saying it. Della let her go, but she stood in the doorway and watched until Tessa reached the end of the street, and Tessa felt the watching on her back the whole way, and it was not an unkind thing to feel. The county road ran straight out of town between cut cornfields gone brown for the season. It took her over an hour to walk it, the box growing heavier the way light things do over distance. The sun was already low and orange by the time the yard came up on her left behind its sagging chain-link fence, and the long shadows of the dead light poles lay across the gravel like fallen ladders. She knew the gap in the fence without looking for it. Pop had shown it to her when she was 7, where the wire had pulled loose from the post, and she had been small enough then to slip through standing up. Now she had to crouch and push the box ahead of her. Then she was inside, on the gravel of the yard, in the place that had been the whole map of her childhood. It was quieter than she remembered. The wind moved through the tall grass that grew up between the rails, and somewhere a loose sheet of metal ticked against a building, but under those small sounds the yard held a deep stillness that the town never had. Rolling stock that would never roll sat rusting on the sidings, a string of hoppers, a single caboose with its windows gone. The water tower leaned. And at the far end, dark against the dying light, stood the roundhouse, the long curved engine shed where the locomotives had once come in off the turntable to be serviced, its row of tall doors hanging open like missing teeth. Pop's whole life had happened in this place. He had hired on as a boy sweeping ash pits, and he had ended as the last man the railroad kept on to close it down, to walk the empty buildings and turn off what could be turned off. She had a memory of him from when she was very small, lifting her up to a cab window, her hands on a throttle bigger than her head, his voice in her ear telling her that a machine would always tell you the truth about itself, if you knew how to listen. "All right, Pop," she said softly, standing in the gravel with the box in her arms and the sandwiches going cold. "I'm here. Now what?" The key was for the floor. Which floor? There were a lot of floors in a rail yard, but there was only one building Pop had ever called his own, the way a man calls a thing his own without owning it. And that was the roundhouse. She walked toward it across the yard, her boots crunching, and the closer she got, the larger it loomed, a great brick crescent with a smokestack vent in every stall for the engines that used to breathe there. That was when she saw the dog. It came around the corner of the sandhouse, low and stiff-legged, hackles up, a gray-muzzled shepherd-looking thing gone lean and wary from living rough. It planted itself between her and the roundhouse and let out a low warning sound that was more breath than bark. Tessa stopped where she was. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. I'm not anybody." The dog held its ground. She crouched down slow, set the box on the gravel, and dug the sandwiches out of the warm sack. She unwrapped one and tore off a corner and tossed it gently into the grass between them. The dog looked at the bread, then at her, then at the bread again. Hunger won. It crept forward, snatched the piece, and backed off to eat it, watching her the whole time. She tossed another, then another. By the time the sandwich was gone, the animal had come close enough that she could see the gray in its coat and the old scar across its nose. And the wariness had drained out of its stance and left something behind that looked almost like an apology. "There," she said. We're not so bad, you and me. Both got put out, looks like. She stood, and the dog did not run. It fell in a few feet behind her, and when she walked toward the roundhouse, it walked too. And then it did a thing that stopped her cold. It went past her. It trotted ahead into the third stall from the end, into the shadows where the last light could not reach, and it stood over a bare patch of the concrete floor and looked back at her and whined. "What's down there?" Tessa said. The dog scratched once at the floor, claws scraping on concrete, and whined again. She came into the roundhouse stall. The smell of the place rose up around her. Old grease and brick dust and the cold mineral breath of a building that the sun never fully reached. The floor of the stall was a mess of decades, fallen ceiling plaster and bird droppings and a drift of dead leaves blown in through the open door, all of it gone the same flat gray. The dog stood in the middle of it, over the spot, waiting. Tessa knelt and began to clear the grime away with her hands. Under the leaves and the dust was the inspection pit, she realized, the long, narrow channel that ran down the center of the stall where men had once stood below the locomotives to work on their undersides. It had been covered over with steel plates when the yard closed. She brushed the filth off the nearest plate, then off the next one, and on the third plate set flush into the steel where no plate had any business having one. Her fingers found the edges of a smaller square, a hatch, a heavy steel hatch with a hasp, and on the hasp, furred orange with rust but unmistakably solid, a padlock. Her heart was going hard now. She wiped her palms on her jeans and dug into her jacket pocket and brought out the brass key, the cold weight of it she had carried for 7 months without knowing why. "The keys for the floor," she whispered. It did not look like a padlock key. It was a switch key, the kind that worked the locks on rail switches and signal boxes all up and down a line, square-shanked made to a railroad's own pattern. But the padlock on the hatch was that same old railroad pattern, a heavy brass body gone green with weather. And when she turned it over, she saw the same worn maker stamp she had seen 100 times on the bow of the key. Her hands were not quite steady. She fit the square shank into the lock. For a moment it would not go, the wards stiff with rust and time. She breathed out the way Pop had taught her to breathe out before she put weight on a stubborn bolt, and she turned it slow and even instead of hard. The lock gave. The shackle popped up out of the body with a small dead sound. The dog had gone very still beside her. She lifted the rusted lock free of the hasp and set it on the steel, and she got her fingers under the lip of the hatch, and she pulled. The hinges had not moved in years, and they fought her. And then they let go all at once, and the hatch swung up and over and clanged down against the plate behind it, and a breath of cool air came up out of the dark below, dry and old and faintly impossibly smelling of machine oil, fresh machine oil. Somebody had been down there, not decades ago, recently. Tessa was still on her knees staring down into that black square, her mind racing to make sense of the smell, when the dog's head snapped up toward the open roundhouse door. Its whole body went rigid. The low sound started again in its chest, but it was a different sound now, not a warning aimed at her. Then she heard it too. Far off, out past the fence, out on the dead main line where the rails were red with rust and the ties had rotted soft, where nothing had moved under its own power since before she was born, an engine had started up. She could hear it clearly in the still evening air, the low diesel mutter of it, and it was not idling. It was moving. It was coming down the line toward the yard, slow and steady and certain, the way a thing comes when it knows exactly where it is going. Tessa rose to a crouch in the dark of the stall. Through the open door, far down the tracks, a single white light had appeared, swaying slightly as it came, and behind it the shape of something low to the rails closing the distance between them. The light came on across the yard, and Tessa stayed low in the shadow of the stall and tried to make herself part of the brick. Every story she had ever heard about places like this ran through her at once. Scrappers who stripped dead yards for copper. Men who did not want to be seen and did not want witnesses. She thought of the open box on the gravel with Pop's coat in it, out there in plain sight, and she thought of the 4 miles back to a town that had locked its door against her, and her mouth went dry. The engine was not a train. She understood that as it slowed, it was too small, too light. The sound of it more lawnmower than locomotive. It rolled up the rusted lead toward the roundhouse and stopped just outside the open doors, and the white light swung as the driver climbed down, and a beam of it raked across the stall and found her crouched against the wall. "Now who in the world," a voice said, an old voice, dry as a corn husk. "Cinder. Cinder, you mangy thief, is that you in there? Who've you gone and dragged home?" The dog left her side and trotted out into the beam with its tail going, and the tension broke out of Tessa's chest so fast it left her dizzy. Whoever this was, the dog knew him. The dog that had warned her off the whole yard walked right up to this man and leaned against his leg. "I'm not stealing anything," Tessa called. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm just..." I needed somewhere to be. The light lowered out of her eyes. She stood up slow, hands open at her sides, and stepped to the doorway where the last gray daylight still reached. And she got her first good look at him. He was old, easily past 70, in a canvas coat and a railroad cap gone soft and shapeless with age. He had a face full of weather and a white mustache stained yellow at one corner from a pipe, and he stood with the slight forward lean of a man whose back had given him 40 winters of trouble. The little track car behind him was a speeder, a four-wheeled motor car barely bigger than a golf cart, painted a yellow that had faded to the color of old butter. He held a long flashlight in one hand, and the other rested on the dog's head, and he was staring at her like he had seen something come up out of the ground. "Say your name," he said. "Tessa." "Tessa what?" "Brandt." The flashlight wavered. For a moment the old man did not say anything at all. His jaw worked under the mustache, and his eyes went bright and wet in the beam's scatter, and when he spoke again his dry voice had gone rough. "Course you are," he said. "Look at you. You got his hands. You're holding them just like he did, down at your sides, ready for whatever comes." He took his cap off and turned it in his fingers. "I'm Ezra. Ezra Quill. I worked this yard alongside your grandfather since before your daddy was born. Last time I saw you, you were about yay high and you jammed a whole fistful of cotter pins up your nose to see how many would fit." A sound came out of Tessa that was half a laugh and half something that had been waiting a long time to get out. "That doesn't sound like me." "It was exactly you." He put the cap back on, Halvor about turned inside out laughing. "Then he made you put every one of them back in the tray." His eyes moved past her into the dark of the stall, and the laughter went out of his face. He had seen the open hatch. He came forward slow, the dog at his heel, and stopped at the lip of it and looked down into the black square in the floor for a long time. He crouched, with a grunt and a hand on his knee, and he picked up the rusted padlock she had set on the steel, and he turned it over and read the maker's stamp by flashlight. And then he looked at the brass key still in her hand. "He give you that key," Ezra said. It was not a question. "In the hospital, the night before she did not finish it. He told me the key was for the floor. I thought he was out of his head. I've had it 7 months. I didn't know what it went to until an hour ago." Ezra nodded slowly, like a man hearing the last line of a story he had been told the beginning of years before. He cut that key himself, off the old switch key blanks. Wouldn't trust a hardware store with it. He pushed himself back up to standing, both hands on his knee this time, and he looked at her with an expression she could not read. "How much do you know," he said, "about what your grandfather did out here after they closed the line?" "Nothing. I thought he just came out here, walked around, remembered things." She swallowed. "There's oil down there. Fresh oil. Somebody's been down there. Somebody has." Ezra reached into the speeder and came out with a second flashlight, a battered thing he smacked twice against his palm until it caught. He held it out to her. "Your grandfather made me promise him something, right at the end. If you ever came out to this yard on your own 2 feet, with that key in your pocket, I was to be the one to show you, not tell you, show you." He clicked his own light back on and pointed it down into the hatch. "Well, here you are on your own 2 feet, so I guess I'm keeping my promise about a year before I figured I'd have to. Mind the 3rd rung. It's loose." The ladder went down into the inspection pit, and from the pit a doorway had been cut through the brick wall, low enough that Ezra had to duck. Beyond it was a tunnel, arched overhead in old soot-blackened brick, the kind they had run under yards a century ago to move ash and coal out of the weather. It ran level for 30 feet, and the air in it was dry and still, and warmer than the world above. Their 2 beams swung along the brick, and Cinder's claws clicked on the floor behind them, and then the tunnel opened out into a room, and Tessa stopped in the doorway and could not move. It was a workshop. Someone had made a whole workshop down here under the dead yard, and not a rough one. A long workbench ran along one wall, its surface worn pale and clean. Hand tools hung above it in neat rows on a pegboard, each one outlined in marker so you would know where it went back. A kerosene lantern sat on the bench beside a coffee can bristling with pencils. There was a cot in the corner with a folded wool blanket squared off at the foot, a little iron stove with its pipe vented up into the dark, and a percolator on top of it, and 2 enamel mugs hung on nails, one of them with a chip out of the rim. And the wall over the bench was covered in drawings. Dozens of them pinned up in careful rows, mechanical drawings done in pencil on graph paper, cross-sections and parts diagrams and lists of measurements in a small square hand she would have known anywhere. Pop's hand. The same hand that had filled the margins of her school notebooks with the right way to do long division when the teacher's way confused her. In the middle of all those drawings, pinned up where a man working at the bench would look up and see them, were photographs of her. Her whole childhood was on that wall, a snow-suited 6-year-old squinting into the sun. a gap-toothed kid on the steps of the elementary school, her at 12 with grease to the elbows, holding up a carburetor she had taken apart and put back together at the kitchen table. A miserable girl in the 8th grade graduation dress she had hated. Someone had been bringing him these. Someone had kept him supplied with her year after year, down here in the dark, and she had never known he wanted them. He kept these down here, she said. Her voice did not work right. He kept them everywhere, Ezra said quietly behind her. But these are the ones he looked at while he worked. Said you kept him honest. Said he wasn't about to do shoddy work with you watching. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. On the corner of the workbench, square and solid, sat a metal box. It was an old fireproof document box, painted a flat military green, and across the lid, in white paint, in pop square capitals, was one word: Tessa. She put her hand on it. It was locked. Not yet, Ezra said gently. There's a thing you need to see first. He was real particular about the order. The box was supposed to be last. He set his light on the bench so it threw a glow up the wall, and he crossed the room to where the brick had been opened up into a second wider archway. This one hung with a heavy canvas curtain gone stiff with dust. He spent the last part of his life down here. After your grandmother passed and after they took the line, this was where he went. Folks in town thought he was just an old man wandering an empty yard, grieving. They felt sorry for him. Ezra took a corner of the curtain in his fist. He let them. It suited him fine to be felt sorry for. It kept them from looking. He pulled the curtain back. The space beyond was a roundhouse stall, one of the long bays off the dead turntable, but this one had been bricked shut at the front so that from the yard it looked like a blank wall, a stall sealed and forgotten. No light had reached it from outside in years. And filling it, nose pointed at the bricked-up door it would one day go out through, under canvas tarps roped down tight against the dust, was something enormous. Ezra walked along its flank, gathering the rope, and he pulled the tarps down in a long slithering rush, and the lantern light fell on black iron and brass. It was a locomotive. A small one, a yard switcher built low and strong for shoving cars around. 6 driving wheels taller than Tessa stood, all of it black as a stove and oiled until it gave back the light in long, soft gleams. The cab was wood and steel. The number on the side of the cab, painted fresh in gold and red and shaded so it stood up off the metal, was a single figure, 9. Number 9, Ezra said. And there was a lifetime packed into the way he said it. Built 19 and 26. She switched this yard her whole life, and mine, and your grandfather's. When the railroad pulled out, they sent everything to the scrapper. Every engine, every car. The 9 was on the list. Halver stood right where you're standing and watched them haul her sisters out of here to be cut up for razor blades. He laid his hand flat on the cold iron of her boiler. So he lied, told the railroad she'd already gone, forged the paper himself, scrap ticket and all. Then he and I rolled her in here in the dark and bricked her up. And everybody in the world believed she was gone, but the two of us. Tessa came forward. She put her hand on the driving wheel on the smooth painted spoke of it, the same way she had put her hand on the carburetor at 12. The metal was real. The whole impossible thing was real. He rebuilt her, she said, stripped her to the frame and built her back up. Every bolt, every fitting he couldn't buy he made on a lathe he carried down here in pieces. Ezra's voice cracked and he let it. The better part of 15 winters, that man spent down here. Alone, mostly. I'd come out nights on the speeder and hold a light for him, and we'd drink that terrible coffee and not say much. He'd be down here till 2 in the morning with his hands raw, and I'd say, Halver, who is this for? You're 70 years old. You'll never get a boiler ticket to run her legal. Who is this for? What did he say? Same thing every time. Ezra turned and looked at her in the lantern light, and his eyes were wet again, and he was smiling under the yellow mustache. He'd point up at that wall of pictures, and he'd say, an engine doesn't care how many times it's been left for scrap. You knock off the rust, you find the fire, and it runs. He wasn't talking about the engine when he said it, Tessa. I want you to understand that. He never once was. She had to sit down. There was a stool by the cab steps, and she sat on it and looked up at the black bulk of the 9 rising over her. And Cinder came and put his head on her knee. And for a while, nobody said anything, and the lantern hissed and the dark pressed in soft around the edges of the light. Why didn't he ever bring me down here, she finally said. If it was for me, I had the key for 7 months. I lived 20 minutes from this yard my whole life. Why is it all secret? Why is everything in this family a secret? Ezra's smile faded. He pulled a second stool over and sat across from her. Slow, and he took his cap off again and held it in his lap. Because he was afraid, he said, that if your uncle ever found out what was down here, it'd be gone before you were old enough to keep it. He turned the cap. Your grandfather wasn't a rich man, but he wasn't a poor one either, not the way folks thought. When the railroad sold off this yard, the land and all, nobody in 3 counties wanted it. Halver bought the whole parcel for back taxes. Couple $1,000 he owned it free and clear, this ground we're sitting under, the roundhouse, the 9, all of it. Put it in his name and told nobody. Bowen said. Tessa's throat tightened around the name. My aunt said the estate had debts. They said Pop died with nothing. They took the house because it was all there was. Ezra went very still. Is that what they told you? He said. That's what they told everybody. The old man stood up. He walked a few steps into the dark and stood with his back to her, and when he turned around his weathered face had changed, and the kindness in it had gone hard and old and tired. Tessa, he said, your grandfather did not die with nothing. He died owning every brick and rail in this yard and the only running steam locomotive in this end of the state, and he left a paper saying exactly who it goes to. I know he did, because I drove him to the lawyer's office in town to sign it 2 springs ago, and I signed my own name on it as a witness. He pointed across the workshop to the green box on the bench with her name painted white on the lid. It's in that box, along with whatever else he wanted you to have last. Your name's on it because it was always going to be yours. Tessa looked at the box. Tessa, in her grandfather's hand. Then why? She started and stopped. Because she already saw the shape of it coming, like weather far off across open fields. Because your uncle was the executor, Ezra said. Everything of Halver's passed across Bowen's desk before it went anywhere else. And 3 weeks after they put your grandfather in the ground, a fellow from a salvage company out of the city started coming around this yard with a clipboard, measuring rail and pricing scrap. I've watched him do it twice now. They're going to sell it, Tessa. The land, the buildings, and everything standing on them, sold by the ton. They've got a date set. They're bringing a crew with torches to cut the 9 up where she sits. His voice dropped, which means your uncle either never read what was in that box, or he read it and he hid it, and he told you a lie 3 weeks deep so he could sell out from under you the one thing your grandfather spent his whole life saving for you to have. The lantern hissed in the silence. Tessa stood up off the stool and crossed the room to the workbench, to the green box, and she put both hands flat on the cold lid with her name on it, and she felt the small, hard weight of the brass key still closed in her fist. The brass key was wrong for the box. She knew it before she tried it. The switch key was square and heavy, and the little lock on the green box took something small and flat. She stood there turning the problem over, and then her eye went to the 2 enamel mugs hanging on their nails, the good one and the chipped one, and she remembered the coffee mug Pop had kept on the windowsill at home, the one he dropped his spare keys into so he would always know where they were. She lifted the chipped mug off its nail. A small flat key slid down the inside and rang against the bottom. He always did that, Ezra said softly. Drove your grandmother to distraction. Keys in the coffee cup, washers in the sugar bowl. The little key fit. The lock turned. Tessa lifted the lid of the green box, and the smell that came up out of it was paper and gun oil and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco, and her chest pulled tight, because it was the smell of him. On top was money. Not a fortune. Banded stacks of worn bills, 20s mostly, money a careful man sets aside a little at a time over a long while. She did not count it then. Under the money were the journals, 6 of them, cloth-bound ledgers filled edge to edge with his small square hand, dated on the spines. Beneath the journals was a stiff manila envelope, and clipped to the front of it was a business card for a lawyer in town, and a folded legal document with a county stamp pressed into its corner. Blue ink gone slightly gray with time. She read the heading on the document twice before it went in. Transfer on death deed. The parcel number. The legal description of the yard, the acreage, the structures, and the name of the person to whom it all passed, typed plain in the middle of the page where there could be no mistaking it. Tessa Marie Brandt. That's the one I witnessed, Ezra said. He did not lean in to look. He had seen it before. He filed the original down at the county the same afternoon. That's just his copy. The real one's been sitting in the public record 2 springs now, where anybody could walk in and ask to see it, including your uncle. Especially your uncle. Under the deed, at the very bottom of the box was a letter, 1 folded sheet, her name on the outside in pencil, the lead gone soft in silver. She lifted it out with both hands and unfolded it, and she sat down on the edge of the cot to read it, and Ezra took the lantern and went and stood by the 9 to give her the room. Tessa, it began, if Ezra has done what I asked him, then you are reading this underground, with my engine in front of you and that dog of the yard somewhere close by, and you have already worked out most of what I should have told you to your face. I was a coward about that. Not about much else in my life, but about that. I could rebuild a boiler, but I could not figure out how to say to your face that you were the best thing that ever happened to a worn-out old man, so I built it for you instead. A person tells the truth in whatever language they have. Mine was always steel. They will tell you that you were not worth keeping. They have probably already told you. Tessa, I spent 40 years hauling home what everybody else had thrown away and putting it back into service. I know to the ounce what a thing is worth after the world has given up on it. You were the most valuable thing that ever came through this yard, and not one of them could see it. That was their failing. It was never yours. Do not pick it up and carry it like it is yours. Her vision blurred and she had to stop and wipe her eyes and start the paragraph again. You need to know some things about your uncle. Because what I am leaving you, I am leaving in his way, and he will not take it kindly. Bowen is not a bad man. He is a hurt one, and I did a good part of the hurting. When your father died, I broke. Your father loved this railroad as much as I did. And when the wreck took him and your mother both, I could not look at Bowen without thinking it should have been the other one of my sons standing there. Because Bowen never cared a thing for engines, and your father was made of them. I did not have to. A boy knows when his father is wishing he were his brother. I let Bowen feel like the spare his whole life, and then I poured everything I had left into you and into this engine, right in front of him, and I never once stopped to ask what that was doing to him. So if my son does something small and bitter after I am gone, something to do with money or this yard or you, I want you to know that I planted that seed myself a long time ago and watered it the rest of my life. Be angry at him. He will have earned it. But leave him a door. I am trying to leave him one too, from wherever it is I am writing you this from. We are none of us only the worst thing we ever did. Run her if you can, Tessa. Get her ticketed and run her. She was never meant to sit. Neither were you. It was signed, simply, Pop. For a long time, Tessa sat on the cot with the letter in her lap and her shoulders shaking. And she let it come. All of it. The grief she had packed down hard since the hospital and the older grief underneath it that went all the way back to a car wreck when she was 6. Cinder climbed up beside her and pressed his whole warm weight against her side. And Ezra stayed over by the engine with his back turned and his cap in his hands, and he let her be. Grief is not a thing you can hold a light for. He knew that. He just stayed, which was the only useful thing anybody could do. When she could speak again, she folded the letter along its soft creases and held it against her chest. He knew, she said. He knew they'd put me out. He knew, and he couldn't stop it, so he left me this instead. He couldn't be sure they'd put you out, Ezra said, but he knew his own son, and he knew you. He bet the whole works on you having the sense to come to the one place that was ever really yours, with the key he gave you, and find your way to the floor. The old man's mustache moved. I'd say he bet right. If you have stayed with Tessa's story this far, take a moment and subscribe, because what comes next is the part her grandfather spent the last years of his life building toward, the part where a girl with $41 and a dead man's engine decides she is not going to be put out quietly after all. She did not sleep much that night. She lay on her grandfather's cot under his squared-off blanket with the engine breathing its cold iron breath in the next room and the dog at her feet. And somewhere past midnight she stopped crying and started thinking. And the thinking was harder and better than the crying. By the time gray light came down the air shaft, she had a list. She did not have paper, so she had it in her head, in order, start to finish, the same as Pop would have. Ezra came down at first light with a thermos and the smell of the world on his coat. He found her already up, already at the workbench, already going through the journals by lantern light. You look like a woman with a plan, he said. I have part of one. She did not look up. The deed's recorded. That makes it real and it makes it public, and Bowen can't unmake it. So why hasn't anybody stopped him from selling? Because nobody's looked. Nobody knows there's anything out here worth a deed. Ezra poured coffee into the chipped mug and handed it to her. As far as the county's concerned, this is a dead industrial parcel some old man bought for back taxes and then died on. Your uncle filed to be executor, told everybody the old man left debts, and started taking offers. The salvage outfit doesn't care whose name is on the deed. They care that somebody with the right last name will sign their paper and cash their check. Then I go to the lawyer. She tapped the card. This one. Today. And I go to the county and I get a copy of the real deed with the stamp on it, and I make it so loud and so public that no salvage company in its right mind comes near this yard. That's a good plan. It's also a slow one. Lawyers are slow. Counties are slower. Ezra sat down heavy on the second stool and he turned the coffee mug in his hands. And I've got to tell you the part you won't like. I went by the gate this morning before I came down. There's a new notice wired to the fence. Auction of salvage rights. They moved it up. The cutting crew comes day after tomorrow at first light to start torching whatever's standing. 2 days, Tessa. The law won't move in 2 days. Paper won't save her in 2 days. Tessa set down the journal. Outside, far off, a truck was slowing on the county road. It turned in at the gate, They came up out of the hatch into the cold morning and stood in the roundhouse doorway, and the truck that had pulled into the yard was a clean late-model pickup, and the man getting out of it was her uncle. Bowen Brandt crossed the gravel with his shoulders up around his ears against the cold, and he stopped about 20 feet off when he saw her, and for a second his big soft face flinched with what looked like shame, and then it shut down and went hard. "They called me," he said. "Salvage company said there was a girl living out here, squatting. I figured it was you." He looked past her at the open roundhouse, at the dark of it. "You can't be out here, Tessa. This isn't yours. None of this is yours. It's all mine," Tessa said. Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that, distantly. One clear fact in the middle of a fire. Pop deeded the whole yard to me before he died. He recorded it at the county. You know he did. You're the executor. It crossed your desk. The color went out of Bowen's face and then came back up red. "That deed won't hold," he said. "Too fast. An old man sick, signing papers. Any lawyer worth a damn could break it." "Then you did read it." Ezra's dry voice came from beside her. "You read it, Bowen. You knew the day after the funeral that this yard was hers, and you went and told that child and the whole town that your father died with nothing but debts. I have known you since you were in short pants. I never once thought you had this in you." "Stay out of it, Ezra." Bowen's voice cracked. He turned back to Tessa, and the words came out of him in a rush now, like something that had been under pressure a long time. "You don't know what it's been. You think the old man left me anything but this mess. House mortgaged twice. Tax bills. Sandra's hours got cut at the clinic, and then I find out he had this whole place. The land alone is worth something to the right buyer, and the steel. 40 tons of scrap iron sitting under a tarp, and he leaves it to a teenager who can't even." He stopped. His jaw worked. "He never left me one thing my whole life. Not one. And the one time there's finally something, it's got your name on it too." And there it was, out in the cold air between them. The real thing, the hurt the letter had named. Tessa looked at her uncle, at his red face and his wet eyes, and she understood for the first time that he was not a villain in a story. He was a 60-year-old boy who had never stopped waiting for his father to choose him. It did not make the box on the porch hurt less, but it changed the shape of the hurting. "He wrote about you," she said quietly. "In the letter, he said he was sorry. He said he wished he'd seen you." For 1 second, Bowen's whole face came open, hungry, and Tessa saw exactly how much he wanted that to be true. Then his face closed again over the want, because wanting it was more dangerous than not. "Don't," he said. "Don't you tell me what he wrote. He's gone. The bills aren't." He backed toward his truck. "Salvage crew comes tomorrow at first light." They moved it up. "I signed the rights over last night." His voice dropped, and for just a moment the bitterness fell off it and left a different note underneath. Almost a warning, a man trying to do a kindness in the only language he had left. "Be gone before they get here, Tessa. Those torches don't care what's got somebody's name on it. Take your things and go, and don't be standing in this yard at dawn." He got in the truck and pulled out, gravel spitting from under the tires, and the gate swung shut behind him. And the yard was quiet again except for the wind and the loose sheet of metal ticking against the sandhouse. Tessa stood in the cold and watched the dust of him settle on the road. "Tomorrow," she said, "not 2 days. Tomorrow at first light." "Tomorrow at first light," Ezra said. He had gone gray in the face. "Tessa, I have to be straight with you, the way your grandfather would want. Even if we had the law on our side and a month to work, there's a thing about that engine you need to understand." He looked back into the dark of the roundhouse where the 9 waited. "Your grandfather finished her, near enough, but he died that winter before he ever lit her fire. She has never been steamed, not once since the line closed. She has never turned a wheel under her own power in all the time he worked on her. He built her right. I'd stake my life he built her right. But built right and proven to run are 2 different animals, and the only way to find out which one she is to put fire in her belly and water in her boiler, and find out the hard way." Tessa turned and looked at the black shape of the engine in the dark, the thing her grandfather had poured the end of his life into, the thing that had never once moved. "Then that's what we do," she said. "We find out the hard way tonight." Ezra looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light, and then he did something she had not seen him do yet. He laughed, short and surprised, and shook his head. "You are so much his," he said. "All right, tonight, but I can't fire a cold boiler and bring her out and stand off a salvage crew with just the 2 of us and a dog. If we're doing this, I'm making some calls. There's men still living who poured their lives into this yard. Same as Halvor. They're old and they're stiff, and most of them think the 9 got cut up for scrap a lifetime ago. I expect a few of them would crawl out here on their hands and knees to find out different. He climbed up to the speeder and drove off into the dusk, and Tessa stood alone in the roundhouse with her grandfather's engine and started to learn it. She climbed up into the cab. She put her hands on the throttle and the reverser and the brake, the controls he had rebuilt and polished, and she read the journals by lantern light, his notes on every valve and fitting, his diagrams of the firing pattern, the water glass, the pressure she could trust, and the pressure she could not. He had left her an instruction manual written in love and disguised as engineering. She read until her eyes burned. The first headlights swung across the yard a little after 8. They came in old trucks, one, and then two, and then a whole slow procession of them, and they parked in a rough line on the gravel with their lights pointed at the roundhouse, and the men who climbed down out of them were gray and bent and moved careful in the cold. One was a boilermaker who had to be helped down from his cab. Another had fired locomotives on this line before Tessa's father was born. A third was a retired boiler inspector who still carried his gauge in a wooden case worn smooth at the corners. They came across the gravel toward the open doors, and they stopped when the lantern light found the black flank of the 9 inside, and the number gold and red on her cab, and not one of those old men said a word for a while. Then the boilermaker took off his hat. "Hello, old girl," he said. His voice came apart on it. "We thought you were gone." "He hid her," Tessa said from the cab steps. "My grandfather. He hid her and he rebuilt her, and he left her to me, and a salvage crew is coming to cut her up at first light, unless we can prove tonight that she runs." She came down the steps into the ring of them. This girl with $41 and a dead man's coat, facing a dozen men who had each given the better part of a life to this place. "I can't pay any of you. I've got nothing to pay you with. But she's full of my grandfather's work, and if there's a chance to wake her up before they take a torch to her, I'd like to take it. With your help. Tonight." The old fireman looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the engine. Then he started rolling up his sleeves over forearms gone thin and spotted but still corded with old muscle. "Girl," he said, "I've been waiting half my life for somebody to give me a reason to be useful again. Where do you want me?" What happened in that roundhouse over the next 9 hours, Tessa would carry the rest of her life. The first thing was the wall. Pop had bricked the 9 into her stall, but he had laid that front wall single and light, mortared soft, made to come down when the day came. 2 of the men took sledges to it, and the brick came away in slabs, and cold night air poured into the sealed stall for the first time since before Tessa was born. And beyond the falling wall, the rails of the stall ran straight and clean out onto the lead. The one track in the whole yard her grandfather had kept clear, because he had always meant for her to have a straight road out. They filled her boiler from a tank on the back of one of the trucks, hose run in through the dark, the inspector watching the water glass and calling the level. They knocked the rust scale out of her firebox and laid the fire as the journals showed, wood first and then the coal Pop had stacked in the tunnel against this very night. The inspector went over her with his gauge and his eyes and his blunt old hands. Every seam, every stay, the things that kill a man if they let go, and at the end of an hour he straightened up and wiped his hands and said the words that mattered. "She's sound. Whatever that old fool was, he was a craftsman. Light her." Tessa lit the fire herself. Ezra put the long match in her hand and stood behind her, and she reached into the firebox and touched the flame to the kindling, and it caught, and the men let out a breath together, and the first orange light of fire came up inside number 9 since the line had died. After that, it was waiting, and tending and feeding the fire, and watching the needle on the pressure gauge that did not move, and then, somewhere past midnight, trembled, and lifted, and began to climb. Della came around 1 in the morning. She had heard the way the whole town was beginning to hear, and she came through the broken wall with 2 coolers and a coffee urn and her reading glasses fogging up. And she set up a kitchen on the workbench under the wall of Tessa's photographs and started feeding old men who had not been fed by anybody in a long time. Word was moving through Calder in the dark. Phones were ringing. Porch lights were coming on. People who had grown up with the sound of the 9 working the yard, people who had been told as children that the steam engines were gone for good, were getting in their cars and driving out the county road toward a glow and a column of wood smoke rising off the dead rail yard. By 4 in the morning, there were 100 people standing in the cold outside the roundhouse, and the pressure gauge on number 9 read 140 pounds and still climbing, and steam was sighing from her fittings, and she had begun, very faintly, to tick and groan and shift on her springs as the heat brought all that sleeping iron back to life. She was alive, she was not moving yet, but she was alive, breathing warm to the touch, all down her great black side, and Tessa stood with her hand flat against the boiler and felt the engine her grandfather built shudder and settle like a thing waking from a long sleep. And she finally understood what he had been doing down here alone all those winters. He had not been building her a machine. He had been building her a family that would have to come back to life to save it. An old crew and a dead engine and a whole town. All of it sleeping, all of it waiting for one girl with a key to come and find the fire. The east went gray. And down the county road, headlights appeared. A line of them. The salvage company came first. A flatbed truck and a crew cab and a low trailer built to haul cut steel. And behind that, last, her uncle's clean pickup. They pulled up at the gate in a row, and doors opened, and men got out into the cold dawn and stopped, because the gate was full of people, and past the people the roundhouse was glowing. And out of the roundhouse came a sound none of them had heard in a lifetime. The slow, deep, patient breathing of a live steam locomotive with her fire up. The sheriff came through the crowd with his thumbs in his belt, not unkind, a man doing a job he had not chosen. The salvage foreman came behind him with a clipboard and a contract and a face already going sour. And Bowen came last of all, hanging back at the edge of the crowd, looking at the glow of the roundhouse like a man looking at something he had buried that had climbed back out of the ground. "I'm told there's a salvage contract on this parcel," the sheriff said, when he reached Tessa at the roundhouse door. "And I'm told there's a young lady been squatting out here. I don't want trouble this morning, so somebody show me some paper." The salvage foreman held up his contract. "Signed and dated, Bowen Brandt, executor of the estate. We start cutting at first light. That's now." Tessa held up the deed. The real one. Ezra had driven into town in the speeder at 3 in the morning and waited on the county clerk's porch, and the clerk had come down in her robe and let him pull the certified copy from the public record. The original transfer on death deed, county stamp and all, her name in the middle of it. "Tessa Marie Brandt," she said. "This yard was deeded to me by Halver Brandt before he died, and recorded at the county the same day, and it has been sitting in the public record where anybody could read it. My uncle was never the owner. He was the executor of an estate that this yard was never part of, because my grandfather signed it over to me while he was alive. You can't sell a thing that isn't yours, and he can't buy one." She held the paper out to the sheriff. "It's all there. Stamped. Recorded. Older than that contract by 2 springs." The sheriff read it. He read it twice, the way a careful man reads a thing that is about to make his morning complicated. Then he handed it back, and he turned to the salvage foreman, and he said, "Son, you bought salvage rights off a fellow who didn't own the salvage. That's between you and him in a courtroom. But you're not cutting up one bolt of anything on this girl's land today. Load up." The salvage foreman started to argue. Then he looked at the deed in Tessa's hand, and the sheriff's flat expression, and he did the math salvage men are good at, and he folded his clipboard. And that was when number 9 spoke. Inside the roundhouse, the old fireman had been watching the gauge, and the needle had touched the line Pop's journal called her working pressure, and he had reached up and pulled the cord, and the whistle of number 9, the big 3-chime whistle her grandfather had rebuilt with his own hands, opened up over the rail yard in the gathered town in the cold dawn fields for the first time in a generation. It was not a sound so much as a thing you felt in your chest, in the fillings of your teeth, in the ground under your feet. It rolled out across the county and bounced off the grain elevator and came back, and 100 people put their hands over their mouths. And old men who had not cried since they were boys stood in the gravel with tears running into their collars, and Cinder threw back his head and howled along with it. And Tessa felt her grandfather all around her in that sound. Every winter he had spent alone in the dark, so that this morning could happen. "Come on," Ezra said in her ear. His hand was on her shoulder. "She's yours. He didn't build her to sit in a shed, and he didn't build you to stand at a gate. Get up in that cab." She climbed up. Ezra came up beside her, and the old fireman swung down to let her have it, and Tessa Brandt put her hand on the throttle her grandfather had rebuilt for hands he hoped would one day be hers. "Easy," Ezra said. "She's strong. Crack it slow. She only goes 2 ways. Forward or back. Nobody ever built a thing like this to sit still." His voice went rough. "Same as you, girl. Now bring her home." Tessa eased the throttle open. Steam hissed into the cylinders. The big driver strained, slipped, caught, and then with a long exhale of steam and a groan of waking steel, the whole black weight of her began to move. Number 9 rolled forward out of the stall her grandfather had sealed her into, out through the broken wall and the falling brick, out into the gray light of the yard where she had not turned a wheel in the memory of anyone living. The crowd opened. The whistle sang again, and the whole town of Calder stood in the cold and watched a banished girl bring a dead engine back down the line. And they heard it coming, the same as Tessa had heard it coming in the dark the night her whole life turned over. Only now there was nothing in the sound to be afraid of. She brought the 9 to a slow stand at the yard throat, near the gate, near the crowd near the salvage trucks that were now backing out one by one, and she set the brake as the journal showed, and the engine stood there breathing under her, and she looked down out of the cab. Bowen was standing alone at the edge of it all. The other people fell back from him without meaning to. And he stood by himself in the open gravel in his good coat with the engine breathing over him, and his father's whole hidden life laid bare in front of the entire town. And his big soft face was wet. And he was looking up at Tessa in the cab with an expression that had nothing left in it to defend with. The story he had told himself his whole life, that his father had left him nothing and loved him not at all, was standing in front of him in black iron and steam. And it had a girl at the throttle. And the girl was not him. Tessa reached into the pocket of her grandfather's denim coat, the coat she had pulled out of a cardboard box on a porch the morning before, and she took out the letter, the one folded soft along its creases, and she climbed down out of the cab and walked across the gravel to her uncle and held it out to him. "He wrote you a part too," she said. "It's right here. He says he's sorry. He says he had a hand in making you the way you are, and he's sorry for it, and he asks me to leave you a door." Her voice was steady and low, and only for him. "I'm leaving you a door, Bowen. Read what your father actually said before you decide nobody ever loved you. You owe him that much. You owe yourself that much." Bowen took the letter in both hands like it might break. He looked at the pencil, at his father's small square writing going gray with time, and his mouth worked, and no sound came out, and over his bent gray head, number 9 breathed her slow steam into the brightening sky. Bowen did not stay to watch the rest. He took the letter and got back in his truck and drove off toward town with it lying on the seat beside him, and Tessa let him go, because there is reading a man has to do by himself. The 9 ran up and down the lead twice more that morning while the town stood and watched, and then the crew banked her fire and let her cool slow, because a boiler that cools too fast will crack. People did not want to leave. They stood around the warm engine in the cold morning and put their hands on her and told their children that that is number 9. Your great-grandfather worked beside her. We thought she was gone. By the time the sun was full up, there were 3 generations of one family standing on the gravel, and the youngest of them, a girl of maybe 4, was asleep on her father's shoulder with one small hand still pointed at the engine. That was the beginning of it. The papers came out to the yard the next week, and then a man from the State Historical Society, and then a fellow who made videos for the internet about old machines, and the story of the banished girl and her grandfather's hidden engine went further than Calder had gone in a generation. But the story was the small part. The real work started quiet, the morning after, when the old crew came back without being asked, and stood in the roundhouse and looked at Tessa and waited to be told what came next. She told them she had been thinking about it on the cot all night. He didn't build her to be a museum piece behind a rope, Tessa said. He built her to run. So we run her, we fix the track out to the river and back. We get her ticketed legal, and we give people rides. Real rides. We charge enough to keep her in coal and keep the lights on. And we put every spare nickel back into the yard. And anybody who worked this railroad or whose people did, rides for free as long as they live. The boiler inspector did the proper certification himself that spring, the hydrostatic test and the forms and the stamp, all of it legal and above board, so that no county official would ever again have cause to shut her down. The fireman taught Tessa to fire and then to drive, on the long quiet evenings after the crew went home, until she could bring the 9 up the lead and stop her on a dime with the platform exactly where she wanted it. Ezra ran the speeder out ahead every morning to check the rail, the same as he had done alone in the dark for years, except now there was a reason for it, and now he was not alone. As winter loosened into spring, the whole yard came back to life around them. They cleared the brush off the sidings and patched the roundhouse roof and got the water tower standing straight again and full. They rebuilt the old depot, and Tessa moved into the rooms above it that had been the station agent's once. 2 small rooms with a window that looked out over the whole yard, and she hung Pop's denim coat on a peg by the door and slept better in those 2 rooms than she ever had under her uncle's roof. Cinder slept at the foot of her bed and walked the yard with her every morning, and the gray went on coming in around his muzzle, and she loved him the more for it. The diner filled up. Della had to hire 2 girls and then a third, because on the Saturdays, the 9 ran there was a line out the door of people who had driven 2 hours to ride a steam train and eat a piece of pie in a town they had never heard of before the story went around. Half the brown paper came down off the storefronts on the main street. A hardware store that had been closing reopened. None of it was a fortune, and Calder did not become anything it was not, but a town that had been quietly dying sat up and started breathing again, and a good part of the reason was a black engine and a girl who would not get on a bus. Bowen came back to the yard in April. He came alone on a weekday, when there were no crowds. Tessa was up on the running board with an oil can when she heard the truck, and she came down wiping her hands, and they stood looking at each other across the gravel for a while. "I read it," he said finally. "The letter. I've about worn it out reading it." His voice was rough. "He says in there he should have taught me to love the engines instead of holding it against me that I didn't. He says that was his job and he failed it. My whole life I thought he looked at me and saw the wrong son living. Turns out he looked at me and saw a thing he broke and didn't know how to fix. He stopped and pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. I sold your inheritance out from under you, Tessa, for scrap. I don't know how a man comes back from a thing like that. You start by standing in the yard, Tessa said. Pop left you a door. I'm not going to be the one who shuts it. It was not all healed in a morning. Sandra did not come, not that spring, and Tessa did not push it. But Bowen started coming out on the weekends, and it turned out he was good with the books, good with the things the old crew hated, the permits and the insurance and the ledgers, and he had a way with the visitors that none of the rest of them did. He stopped looking like a man being slowly crushed under something. One Saturday in June, Tessa looked up from the platform and saw her uncle lifting a child up to the cab window to put her small hands on the throttle, telling her to be careful, telling her this was his father's engine, and his eyes were wet. And Tessa had to turn away and busy herself with the brake so he would not see that hers were too. The boy came in August. She found him one evening behind the sandhouse, with a coil of copper wire in his hands and a bolt cutter he had clearly stolen, frozen in the beam of her flashlight, too thin, in a jacket too small for the season that was coming. He could not have been more than 13. He had the flat, ready, watchful eyes of a kid who had learned that the next bad thing was always close, and Tessa knew those eyes because she had worn them herself standing on a porch with a cardboard box. That copper's not worth what you'll get for it, she said, lowering the light. I know because I priced it. What's your name? He thought about running. She watched him think about it. Then the fight went out of him, the plain tiredness of a kid who has been running too long. And he said, Wes? And then, because he could not help it, I wasn't going to take much. You hungry, Wes? He did not answer, which was an answer. She took him to the diner. Della took one look at him over the top of her reading glasses, the same look she had once given a 19-year-old with a box, and she put a plate in front of him without being asked, and she stood over him while he ate too fast and told him to slow down. There was more. There was always more. He's aged out of nowhere yet, Tessa said quietly to Della at the counter. He's a runner. Group home in the next county. He's going to keep running, and one of these times it's going to be somewhere worse than my yard. Then he'll stay at your yard, Della said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. She wiped the counter that did not need wiping. We'll get the right papers, you and me and that lawyer of your grandfather's. It can be done. Around here, you don't get to be poor in the things that count, honey. We will not stand for it. She nodded at the boy hunched over his plate. Somebody didn't stand for it with you. You going to be the one who looks away from him. Tessa was not. It took until the leaves turned, and it took more forms than a steam boiler, but by the first frost the boy had a room above the depot across the hall from hers, and a job oiling rod bearings that paid in real money, and a place at Della's counter, and an old man named Ezra who had decided without discussion that he was going to teach this one to run a speeder. Wes still flinched when a voice got loud. He still kept his shoes by the bed where he could find them in the dark. But he stopped running because for the first time there was something behind him worth more than whatever was ahead. On a bright Saturday morning the next fall, almost exactly a year from the day she had been put out, Tessa stood in the cab of number 9, with her hand on the throttle and the boiler hot under her and the platform full of people waiting to ride. Wes was down on the gravel at the fence, the same fence she had once crawled through with a cardboard box, showing a family where to stand for the best view. He had grown 2 inches. He had color in his face now. And as Tessa eased the throttle open and brought the 9 up the lead toward the platform, slow and certain and full of fire, she watched the boy at the fence go still, and then she watched him grin, because he could hear it coming, the deep, patient breathing and the song of the rods, an engine coming up out of the morning toward a yard full of people glad to see it. There was nothing in the sound for him to be afraid of. She had made sure of that. Ezra was beside her in the cab, gray and bent and grinning, his hand resting on the boiler the same as it had rested on her shoulder the morning the 9 first moved. Cinder rode the running board with his nose into the wind, and down on the platform, near the back, a heavy-set man in a good coat was lifting a child up so she could wave at the engineer, and the engineer was a girl that the whole world had once decided was worth nothing, and she waved back. Pop had told her once, lifting her up to a cab window when she was small, that a machine would always tell you the truth about itself if you knew how to listen. She understood now that he had never been talking only about machines. The yard was not dead, it had only been waiting. People were the same. Every one of them out there on the platform. Every cast-off and leftover and put-out soul the world had stacked in the dark and given up on. They were not dead either. They were waiting. Most of them just needed somebody to come along with the right key and knock off the rust and find the fire. Tessa brought number 9 to a stop at the platform, exactly where she wanted it, and she reached up and pulled the cord, and her grandfather's whistle rolled out over the town one more time into the clear autumn sky. Then she set the brake and looked out over all of it, the yard alive and the people coming, and she let herself rest there a moment in the steam and the morning, finally and completely home.